A black woman, Sarah Jones, was accused of faking a priority seat. Moments later, the airline CEO, Daniel Harris, stepped in and fired the accusers. The airport was alive with the usual chaos, voices echoing, suitcases rolling, and announcements blaring overhead. Amid the crowd, Sarah approached the gate, her boarding pass in hand and her head held high. But the moment she reached the counter, the gate agent's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a scrutinizing glare. What should have been a routine moment spiraled into something far greater, an encounter that exposed deeply rooted biases and sparked a chain of events no one could have predicted. What unfolded next would leave everyone watching stunned, and one woman determined to reclaim her dignity. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The airport thrummed with its usual symphony of movement and noise. Travelers hurried by with determined strides, their luggage wheels clicking against the polished floor. Overhead, a steady stream of announcements echoed through the terminal, providing a backdrop to the hum of conversations. Sarah Jones moved through the crowd with the grace of someone accustomed to commanding her own space. Her tailored navy blazer and crisp white blouse exuded an effortless sophistication that made people glance her way. She was calm, composed, and ready for the long-haul flight that awaited her. As she neared Gate 14, she noticed the priority boarding line moving swiftly. A blonde gate agent, Emily Baker, stood at the podium, efficiently scanning tickets. She greeted passengers with polite smiles, her tone warm and accommodating. Sarah joined the line, clutching her priority boarding pass, her ticket to comfort on this journey. It was a small luxury she had allowed herself after years of hard work, a reminder of how far she'd come. But as her turn approached, she couldn't ignore the small knot of unease forming in her stomach. When she reached the front of the line, Emily's demeanor shifted. The friendly warmth she had shown the passengers ahead of Sarah vanished the moment her eyes landed on her. Instead, Emily's gaze swept over Sarah with deliberate slowness, taking in her natural curls, her dark complexion, and her confident stance. "Let me see your ticket," Emily said, her tone clipped and professional, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it, a tone Sarah recognized all too well. Sarah handed over the ticket, her face calm but her chest tightening. Emily took it, her fingers lingering on the paper as if holding it too long could uncover some hidden deceit. She glanced back up at Sarah, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Priority boarding?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that she made no effort to hide. "Yes," Sarah replied evenly. Emily turned her attention to the scanner, sliding the ticket under it. The machine remained silent. No beep, no green light. She tried again, pressing the paper down harder this time, but the result was the same. "That's odd," Emily said, her voice louder now, enough to draw the attention of passengers nearby. She turned back to Sarah with a faint smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "It's not scanning." Sarah felt a heat rise in her chest, but she kept her composure. "The scanner might be malfunctioning," she said calmly. Emily raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Or," she began, her voice slow and deliberate, "this might not be a valid ticket." Sarah froze for a moment, stunned by the insinuation. Around her, murmurs began to ripple through the growing line of passengers. Emily tilted her head, her expression one of exaggerated sympathy. "We've seen this sort of thing before," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the people behind Sarah to hear. "Someone prints out a fake ticket, thinking they can slip into priority boarding. It happens more often than you'd think." Sarah's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain steady. She had faced these microaggressions before, those subtle, insidious jabs wrapped in a veneer of professionalism. "I can assure you, this is a legitimate ticket," Sarah said firmly. "I purchased it directly through your website." Emily's lips curled into a faint smile, her eyes scanning Sarah again as if her appearance alone was evidence of fraud. "Sure," she said with an air of dismissiveness. "You wouldn't believe the kind of stories people tell me, but I'm not here to argue. I'll just call security, and we can sort this out." Sarah's jaw tightened as Emily turned away, speaking into her radio with a flourish that seemed designed to draw even more attention to the scene. Behind Sarah, the whispers grew louder. She doesn't look like she belongs in priority. Maybe she's trying to sneak in. I've heard it happens. Why else wouldn't it scan? The words sliced through Sarah, each one a reminder of the biases she had fought her entire life. She felt her heart pound in her chest, but refused to let it show. They don't know you, she reminded herself. They're not worth your anger. When Emily turned back, she crossed her arms, her smug smile firmly in place. Security will be here in a moment, she said, her tone almost gleeful. Sarah stared at her, her mind racing. It's not just the scanner, she realized. She's already decided I don't belong here. My seat, my clothes, my confidence, it's too much for her. To her, I'm out of place simply because I'm black. Do you treat all your passengers like this? Sarah asked, her voice low but sharp. Emily's smile faltered for a split second before returning, colder now. We treat everyone the same, she said, but her tone betrayed her. Sarah could see it clearly now, the way Emily's eyes lingered on her, searching for flaws, for any excuse to discredit her. It wasn't about the ticket, it never had been. Before she could respond, 2 security officers arrived, their expressions neutral, but their presence heavy. What seems to be the problem? One of them asked. Emily gestured towards Sarah with a dramatic wave. This passenger claims she has a priority ticket, but it won't scan. I suspect it might be unauthorized. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. You've faced worse than this, she thought. She pulled out her phone and opened the airline's app, displaying her booking confirmation. Here is my receipt, she said, holding the screen toward the officers. It matches the seat on the ticket. One of the officers leaned in to look, but Emily waved it off with a dismissive laugh. Anyone can fake a screenshot, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Sarah felt her composure begin to crack. Your scanner is broken, she said, her voice firm but controlled. And instead of fixing the issue, you're treating me like a criminal. What? Emily's eyes narrowed. If you're so confident, she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, you won't mind waiting while we sort this out. Sarah's heart pounded, but she stood tall, refusing to let the humiliation show. Around her, passengers whispered, their stares burning into her. Nearby, a man dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. Sarah's pulse raced, but her resolve hardened. This isn't just about me, she thought. This is about every assumption people like her make about people like me. I won't let her win. For now, she waited, the fire in her chest burning brighter with each passing second. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sarah stood still, her fingers gripping her phone tightly, the glow of the booking confirmation illuminating her hand. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against her chest like an unseen weight. She glanced at the security officers, then back at Emily, who was now standing with her arms crossed, her smug expression unwavering. Emily's gaze bore into Sarah, her sharp eyes filled with a barely concealed disdain. Well, Emily said, her voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. If your ticket is valid, why hasn't it scanned? Seems pretty simple to me. Sarah drew in a slow, measured breath, trying to keep her composure. It's not simple when the scanner isn't working, she replied, her tone even but firm. Emily let out a small laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to amuse but to belittle. Convenient excuse, isn't it? A broken scanner? She tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. Or maybe you're just upset because you got caught. The words hit Sarah like a slap. She could feel the eyes of the onlookers burning into her, their judgment palpable. The whispers around her grew louder, and though the individual words blurred together, the intent was clear. They think I don't belong here. They think she's right. Sarah's voice dropped, sharp and cutting. Caught doing what exactly? Buying the seat I'm entitled to? Following the same rules as everyone else in this line? Emily took a step closer, leaning slightly over the counter, as if her proximity would somehow intimidate Sarah. Listen, she said, her voice low and condescending. I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. And people like you, well, let's just say I've seen this kind of thing before. Sarah's eyes narrowed. People like me, she echoed, her voice like steel. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the smirk on her face remained. You know what I mean, she said dismissively. The tension snapped like a taut rope. Sarah took a step forward, closing the distance between her and Emily. She didn't raise her voice, but the intensity in her tone silenced the murmurs around her. No, she said, her words deliberate. I don't know what you mean. Why don't you explain it to me? What about me makes you think I don't belong here? Emily blinked, clearly unprepared for the direct challenge. Well, it's not personal, she stammered, but her earlier confidence wavered. Not personal? Sarah shot back, her voice rising slightly. You've accused me of fraud in front of all these people. You've humiliated me for no reason other than your own assumptions. If that's not personal, I don't know what is. The first security officer, sensing the situation escalating, stepped forward. Ladies, he said, his voice calm but firm. Let's keep this civil. Sarah turned to him, her frustration now boiling over. Civil? I've been civil. I've stood here calmly while she questioned my integrity, called security on me, and tried to make me out to be a criminal. At what point does someone hold her accountable? The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Emily interjected, her tone icy. Look, she said, her voice dripping with feigned politeness. If you're going to make this about something it's not, that's on you. I'm just doing my job. Your job, Sarah repeated, her voice incredulous. She gestured around her, to the crowd, to the security officers, to the entire scene. Is this your idea of doing your job? Treating paying customers like criminals because of your own bias? Emily's face flushed, and her hands clenched at her sides. I don't have to listen to this, she snapped. Security, can you please remove her from the line? She's clearly disrupting the boarding process. The younger security officer stepped forward, his posture stiff. Ma'am, he said to Sarah, his tone professional but firm. We're going to need you to step aside while we sort this out. Sarah didn't move. She felt the anger rising in her chest, threatening to spill over. She was tired of being treated as if she didn't belong, tired of fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady but defiant. I have nothing to hide, and I'm not going to let her treat me this way without consequence. Emily scoffed, crossing her arms again. This is exactly the kind of behavior I was talking about, she said, directing her words to the officers. Entitled, argumentative, and refusing to follow the rules. The crowd gasped audibly, the weight of her words hitting hard. Sarah's vision narrowed, and her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sheer effort of holding herself together. She stepped forward, her voice firm and unyielding. Let me make one thing clear, she said, her gaze locked on Emily. You don't get to talk about me as if I'm not standing right here. You don't get to decide who I am or where I belong. Before Emily could respond, the sound of a throat clearing interrupted the exchange. The casually dressed man, Daniel Harris, who had been watching, stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. Excuse me, he said, his tone calm but authoritative, but I think this has gone on long enough. Emily turned to him, her expression shifting to one of irritation. Sir, this is a private matter. If you're not involved, I am involved, he interrupted, his voice cutting through hers effortlessly. He held out his phone, revealing an app with the airline's logo. I work for this airline. Emily froze, her eyes darting to the phone, then back to the man. You work for the airline? She echoed, her tone suddenly uncertain. That's right, he said, his gaze steady. And I'd like to know why one of our customers is being treated this way. Sarah's breath caught, and she felt a flicker of hope. Whoever this man was, he had just shifted the balance of power. Emily, however, looked like she was trying to decide whether to double down or backtrack. Well, she began, her voice defensive, I was just following protocol. The ticket didn't scan and That's not protocol, the man interrupted smoothly. His tone was still calm, but there was an edge to it now. Accusing a passenger of fraud without verifying the facts is not protocol. Humiliating them in front of a crowd is not protocol. So, let me ask you again, why is she being treated this way? Emily's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The smug confidence she had worn like armor was cracking, and for the first time, she looked unsure. Sarah watched the exchange, her chest tight with a mix of anger and vindication. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, justice is finally stepping in. The silence that followed the man's question was deafening. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped, every pair of eyes in the terminal fixed on the unfolding drama. Emily's face, once a mask of confidence, now betrayed cracks of unease. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words didn't come. Sarah watched her, A part of her wishing Emily would say what they all knew she wouldn't, that she had targeted Sarah not because of a faulty scanner, but because she had already made up her mind the moment she saw her. The man, his composure unshaken, let the silence linger, his eyes locked on Emily, unyielding, as though daring her to speak the truth. When it became clear that she wouldn't, he sighed quietly and turned to Sarah. "Miss," he said, his tone softer now, "may I?" He gestured toward her ticket, still clenched tightly in her hand. Sarah hesitated for a moment before handing it over. His presence, calm yet commanding, felt like a small anchor in the storm of humiliation and anger she had endured. The man took the ticket and, with deliberate precision, pulled out his phone. He tapped a few buttons, the airline's app glowing on the screen. Within moments, he held the ticket under a portable scanner he'd retrieved from his pocket. A soft beep sounded, followed by a green check mark. "It's valid," he said simply, his voice carrying across the gate area. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some gasped, others exchanged glances, and a few nodded knowingly, as if they had expected this outcome all along. Sarah felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the lingering sting of what she had endured. She glanced at Emily, who now looked as though the ground beneath her feet had started to give way. "Well," Emily said, her voice faltering, "it must have been the scanner after all. These things happen, you know. Technology isn't perfect." She forced a nervous laugh, but no one joined her. The man's expression hardened. "This wasn't about the scanner," he said quietly, but the weight of his words silenced everyone around them. He turned to the security officers, his gaze sharp. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen, but your assistance won't be needed further." The officers exchanged glances before nodding and stepping back, their presence no longer required. Emily's discomfort deepened, and she tried to regain some semblance of control. "I was just doing my job," she said defensively. "You can't fault me for being thorough." The man took a step closer to the podium, his eyes narrowed. "Thoroughness isn't the issue," he said, his voice firm but measured. "The issue is your assumptions. You didn't treat her the same way you treated every other passenger in this line. You singled her out, humiliated her, and called security on her without verifying the facts. That's not thoroughness, that's bias." Emily's face flushed a deep red. I didn't mean," she stammered, but the man cut her off. "You didn't mean what?" he asked, his tone calm but relentless. "You didn't mean to accuse her of fraud? You didn't mean to treat her as though she didn't belong? Or you didn't mean to get caught?" The crowd fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. For so long, she had fought these battles silently, brushing off the stares, the assumptions, the microaggressions, but here was someone, a stranger, putting into words everything she had felt but never said. Emily's hands fidgeted at her sides, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "It wasn't personal," she muttered weakly. "Not personal?" The man's voice rose slightly, the calm veneer giving way to a controlled frustration. "You accused her in front of all these people, dragged security into it, and created a spectacle that could have been avoided with a single verification. And you think that's not personal?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the man raised a hand, silencing her. "My name is Daniel Harris," he said, his voice carrying a new authority. "I'm the CEO of this airline, and I can assure you, this is not how we treat our customers." Gasps echoed through the crowd, and Sarah's eyes widened. She had suspected he worked for the airline, but not at this level. The weight of his presence made sense now, the quiet confidence, the unflinching way he had addressed Emily. Emily looked like she might faint. "Mr. Harris, I didn't realize." "No," he said coldly, "you didn't. And that's exactly the problem." He turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "Miss Jones, on behalf of this airline, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you've been treated. This should never have happened." Sarah nodded slowly, her voice caught in her throat. She had spent so long suppressing her anger and frustration that the sudden acknowledgement felt overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel nodded, then turned back to Emily, his demeanor hardening again. "You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll be conducting a full review of your behavior and handling this internally. Collect your things and leave the gate area." Emily's mouth opened in shock, her face pale. "But Mr. Harris, Now," he said sharply. Emily hesitated for a moment before grabbing her belongings and walking away, her steps hurried and uneven. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she disappeared from view. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, Daniel turned to Sarah once more. "If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let me know," he said sincerely. Sarah met his gaze, her emotions swirling. "I appreciate that," she said after a moment. "But what I want isn't just for me. It's for this kind of treatment to stop, once and for all." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And we'll work on that," he said. "You have my word." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, change was possible. The gate area remained eerily quiet after Emily's abrupt departure. Passengers still gathered in clusters, exchanged hushed whispers, their eyes darting between Sarah, Daniel Harris, and the now empty podium where, moments ago, conflict had ruled. Sarah stood still, her boarding pass clutched in one hand, her phone in the other. Relief coursed through her, but it was mixed with the lingering bitterness of the experience. She took a slow, deep breath, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. "How quickly they judged me," she thought. Daniel Harris's voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Jones, would you step aside with me for a moment? I'd like to have a word." Sarah nodded, her emotions still simmering beneath the surface. As Daniel led her a few steps away from the gate, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. She caught snippets of their conversations, some sympathetic, others still laced with skepticism. I guess she wasn't lying after all. Well, she did look out of place in priority. Maybe they overreacted, but why didn't her ticket scan? Sarah gritted her teeth. Even now, after her innocence had been proven, the weight of prejudice clung to the air like a stubborn shadow. Daniel turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "I want to thank you for your patience back there," he said. "You had every right to lose your temper, but you handled yourself with incredible grace." Sarah tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Grace doesn't always feel like enough," she said quietly. "Not when the system itself is against you." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "You're absolutely right. And what happened today is a glaring example of how much work we still need to do." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah broke it first. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice steady. "I don't want compensation. I don't want empty apologies. What I want is accountability, not just for Emily, but for the system that allows people like her to act this way without consequence." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he nodded again, more firmly this time. "You have my word," he said. "We're going to address this, not just her behavior, but the larger issues that led to it. This isn't just about today. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Sarah studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but his gaze remained steady, his expression resolute. "Good," she said finally, "because people like her don't learn unless they're made to." The crowd had begun to disperse, some passengers boarding the plane while others lingered nearby, still trying to piece together the dramatic scene they had witnessed. Sarah walked back toward the gate, Daniel following a step behind. As she approached, an older couple stepped forward hesitantly. The woman, her face lined with concern, offered Sarah a tentative smile. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, her voice soft, "that I'm so sorry for what you went through back there. It was wrong, and it never should have happened." Sarah paused, her initial instinct to brush off the comment as too little, too late, but something in the woman's eyes, a genuine remorse, made her reconsider. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice measured but sincere. The man beside her nodded, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I think we all could have spoken up sooner," he admitted, his tone tinged with regret. "But, well, I guess people don't always know what to do in situations like that." Sarah felt a flicker of frustration but tempered it with a deep breath. "Next time," she said gently, "say something. Staying silent only makes it worse." The couple nodded, their faces somber, as they stepped away. When Sarah finally boarded the plane, she felt the weight of the ordeal begin to lift, but only slightly. She found her seat, a spacious leather chair in the priority section, and settled in, her body tense despite the comfort surrounding her. As she adjusted her seatbelt, she noticed a flight attendant approaching, a young man with a kind smile. He stopped beside her and leaned in slightly. "Miss Jones," he said softly, "on behalf of the crew, I just want to apologize for everything you experienced today." If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask. Sarah studied him for a moment, noting the genuine concern in his eyes. Thank you, she said simply, her voice calm but weary. He nodded and stepped away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as passengers continued to board. Sarah leaned her head back against the seat, her mind replaying the events of the day, the humiliation, the anger, the quiet triumph. It all swirled together, leaving her both exhausted and resolute. She glanced out the window, watching the ground crew prepare for departure. This isn't over, she thought. Not for me, and not for people like me. This is just one battle in a much larger fight. Emily Baker sat stiffly in a small office chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was stark and uninviting, a stark contrast to the confidence she had exuded just hours earlier. Across from her sat Daniel Harris, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the report on his tablet. You've been with this airline for 10 years, Daniel said finally, his voice calm but cold. In that time, you've received multiple complaints about your treatment of passengers, particularly passengers of color. Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. Daniel continued, his tone unrelenting. Today wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern, one that stops now. Emily's face flushed, and she stammered. I didn't mean. You did mean, Daniel interrupted sharply. You made assumptions about Miss Jones because of her appearance, and you acted on those assumptions without evidence. That's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. Emily swallowed hard, her confidence shattered. Please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would go this far. Daniel's gaze hardened. And that's exactly the problem, he said. You didn't think. You didn't care. But now, you'll face the consequences of your actions. As he stood and gathered his things, Emily's world began to crumble. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Sarah looked out the window, her thoughts far from the bustling terminal below. She didn't feel victorious. There was no triumph in facing what she had endured, but there was a sense of purpose, a quiet determination to turn this experience into something meaningful. For now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set in a blaze of gold and crimson. Justice wasn't always swift, she knew, but it had a way of finding its path, one step at a time. The plane leveled off as it climbed above the clouds, its engines humming steadily, a stark contrast to the turbulence Sarah still felt inside. The horizon stretched endlessly outside her window, a blend of soft oranges and blues as the sun dipped lower into the evening. She rested her head against the cool glass, her breath slowing as she tried to process everything that had happened. For a moment, the hum of the cabin was all she could hear. Passengers murmured softly, flight attendants shuffled through the aisle, and the faint clinking of glasses signaled the start of in-flight service. But Sarah felt far removed from it all, cocooned in her own thoughts. The day had started so normally, so predictably. She had planned every detail, her outfit, her schedule, her documents, because that's what life demanded of her, every step meticulously executed to avoid giving anyone an excuse to question her presence, her worth. And yet, none of it had mattered. Sarah replayed the confrontation at the gate, each word from Emily like a splinter lodged beneath her skin, the disbelief in her voice, the condescension in her smile, the way she had called security without hesitation. It all sat heavy in Sarah's chest. She thought of the crowd, the strangers who had stared at her, whispered about her, judged her. Their reactions had varied. Some had sided with Emily, others had watched in silence, too uncomfortable or unsure to intervene. A few had apologized afterward, but their words felt hollow, like offering a bandage for a wound still bleeding. She clenched her jaw, a familiar anger bubbling up. Why is it always like this? She thought. Why do I always have to prove myself, explain myself, defend myself? Sarah was pulled from her thoughts when the young flight attendant returned, his friendly smile softening the edges of her frustration. He held a tray with a glass of sparkling water and a small bowl of warm nuts. I thought you might like this, he said gently, placing them on her tray table. Sarah looked up at him, her expression guarded. She didn't want pity, didn't want to be treated like a charity case, but something in his demeanor, a quiet respect, free of judgment, made her pause. Thank you, she said, her voice subdued but sincere. He nodded and hesitated for a moment. If there's anything else you need, just let me know, he added before walking away. Sarah watched him go, her heart softening slightly. His gesture didn't erase what had happened, but it was a reminder that not everyone saw her the way Emily had. As she sipped the water, her mind drifted to the past. This wasn't the first time she had been treated as though she didn't belong. It wasn't even the worst. She thought of the teacher in high school who had accused her of cheating on a test she had aced, simply because no one gets a perfect score on their first try. She remembered the job interview where the recruiter had questioned whether she had really earned her degree, despite the transcript she had brought as proof, and the countless times she had walked into stores or restaurants, only to be met with suspicious glances or condescending remarks. Each memory was a scar, a reminder of the battles she had fought to prove herself again and again. And while she had won some of those battles, the cost of each one weighed on her. Her thoughts shifted to Daniel Harris, the airline CEO who had stepped in at the gate. His calm authority, his refusal to let Emily's actions go unchecked. It had been a rare moment of vindication. But even his intervention couldn't erase the sting of what had happened. Sarah wondered if his promise to address the systemic issues within the airline would lead to real change, or if it was just another corporate platitude meant to smooth over a public relations nightmare. She wanted to believe him, but she had seen too much, endured too much, to trust easily. Sarah reached for her bag, pulling out a sleek leather notebook and a pen. Writing had always been her way of processing, of making sense of the chaos in her mind. She opened to a blank page and began to write, her pen moving steadily across the paper. She didn't write about her anger or frustration. Those emotions were too raw, too consuming. Instead, she wrote about what needed to change, about how airlines and so many other institutions needed to address the biases that lurked beneath the surface, about the importance of accountability, not just for individuals like Emily, but for the systems that allowed them to thrive. Her words flowed easily, fueled by a deep, simmering determination. By the time she finished, she had filled 3 pages. She stared at the last sentence, her resolve hardening. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unwelcome. And it's time for that to end. As the plane began its descent, Sarah closed her notebook and tucked it back into her bag. She glanced out the window, the twinkling lights of the city below casting a soft glow across the horizon. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a flicker of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting or forgiving. It was the peace of knowing she had stood her ground, of knowing she had turned pain into purpose. The seatbelt sign dinged, and the flight attendant returned to collect her glass. He smiled at her again, and this time, she returned the gesture with a small, genuine smile of her own. The plane's wheels touched down with a soft jolt, yet Sarah remained still, gripping the armrest as though bracing for an impact that had long passed. Around her, passengers began to stir, the once tranquil cabin now filled with the rustling of bags and snippets of idle conversation. For Sarah, the world outside her window, the vast cityscape illuminated in the dusk, felt distant, as if she were suspended between 2 realities. She exhaled slowly, releasing the tension that had built in her chest, yet a hollow ache lingered. The ordeal at the gate had ended hours ago, but its weight clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. When the announcement came to disembark, Sarah waited, allowing the crowd to surge forward. She had no desire to be part of the chaotic rush, nor did she want to face the lingering stares. She knew they were watching her, some out of curiosity, others out of discomfort. When she finally rose, she adjusted her blazer with deliberate precision, holding her head high. If there was one thing she wouldn't allow, it was for them to see her falter. As she retrieved her bag, the young flight attendant who had shown her kindness earlier appeared again. "Miss Jones," he said softly, his voice carrying the same warm sincerity as before. "If you'd like, I can help you with your luggage." She paused for a moment, taking in his genuine expression. She gave him a faint smile, one that carried the exhaustion of the day but also her quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said gently, "but I've got it." The attendant nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. As she moved down the aisle, she caught glimpses of passengers avoiding her gaze or offering awkward, apologetic smiles. She wondered if any of them truly understood what had transpired, or if they even cared. The terminal greeted her with a cacophony of noise and movement, a stark reminder of the chaos she had left behind at the gate. But this time, She felt a subtle shift in herself. The sting of humiliation was still there, but it no longer consumed her. Her eyes scanned the bustling terminal until they landed on a familiar figure standing near the gate's edge. Daniel Harris was waiting, his tall frame composed yet slightly weary, a phone in his hand. When he spotted her, he pocketed the device and approached, his expression somewhere between formal and apologetic. "Miss Jones," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you for your time earlier. I wanted to make sure you arrived safely." Sarah nodded, her expression calm but guarded. "I appreciate that," she said evenly, though her tone hinted at the simmering frustration she still felt. Daniel gestured toward a nearby seating area by the large windows. "If you're not in a rush, I'd like to speak with you briefly." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave the airline, the humiliation, and even Daniel behind, but curiosity, and something deeper, a need for accountability, urged her to stay. "All right," she said simply, following him to the seats. As they settled into the quiet corner, Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His expression was thoughtful, almost pained, as though he had spent the entire flight reflecting on the events at the gate. "Miss Jones," he began, his voice low, "what happened today was unacceptable. I want you to know that I take full responsibility for ensuring it's addressed, not just for you, but for everyone who has ever faced similar treatment." Sarah studied him carefully, her gaze unwavering. "Words are easy, Mr. Harris," she said, her tone calm but pointed. "What I want to know is what you're going to do about it." He nodded, accepting the challenge in her voice. "Emily Baker's employment has already been terminated," he said plainly. "Her behavior violated every standard we hold for our employees." Sarah's expression didn't change. "And what about the system that allowed her to behave that way for so long? You and I both know this isn't just about one person." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're absolutely right," he said. "That's why I've already instructed our HR department to conduct a full review of our training programs. We're implementing mandatory bias training for all employees and creating anonymous reporting channels for passengers and staff to report incidents of discrimination." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her arms crossed. "That's a start," she said, her voice steady. "But training alone won't change the culture. If the leadership doesn't hold people accountable, nothing will change." Daniel leaned back, nodding slowly. "I couldn't agree more," he said. "That's why I'd like to involve you in this process. Your perspective is invaluable, and if you're willing, I'd like to work with you to ensure we're making meaningful, lasting changes." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "You want my help?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "You've lived these experiences. You know the gaps we don't see. If we're going to do this right, we need your voice." She hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. For so long, she had been on the receiving end of these battles, fighting to be heard. The idea of using her voice to influence real change was tempting, but it also felt daunting. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Daniel offered a small smile. "That's all I ask." As Sarah walked away from their conversation, her mind churned with conflicting emotions. She was grateful for Daniel's intervention, yet she couldn't ignore the fact that it had taken a man in his position to bring about justice. Would anything have changed if he hadn't been there? She passed by the gate where it had all begun, now quiet and empty. The memory of Emily's smirk, the whispers of the crowd, and the judgmental stares lingered like ghosts in the space. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Miss Jones." She turned to see the older woman from the gate, her expression tentative but sincere. "I just wanted to say again how sorry I am for what you went through," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "It wasn't right, and I should have spoken up." Sarah regarded her silently for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but next time, don't just watch. Say something. Staying silent helps no one." The woman nodded, her cheeks flushed with shame. "You're right," she murmured. "I'll remember that." Sarah watched as the woman walked away, a mix of hope and weariness filling her chest. As Sarah stepped outside into the cool evening air, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the soft hum of traffic created a comforting rhythm. She hailed a cab and climbed inside, her thoughts heavy yet focused. This was only one battle in a much larger war, one that would require persistence, courage, and allies willing to stand beside her. The cab pulled away, and Sarah glanced out the window, the city blurring into streaks of light. She closed her eyes and rested her head against the seat. The following morning, the city was shrouded in a soft, golden haze as Sarah sat by the window of the hotel's cafe, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. She gazed out at the skyline, her thoughts steady yet heavy, like ripples settling on the surface of a still lake. Her phone vibrated on the table, breaking her reverie. It was an email from Daniel Harris, marked with a single subject line: updates and accountability. Sarah hesitated before opening it. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, as she considered what his message might say. She finally tapped it open, her eyes scanning the words carefully. Inside, Daniel detailed the steps the airline had taken overnight. Emily's dismissal was finalized, and the company had begun a comprehensive internal review. Complaints against other staff members were being reopened, and an external firm had been hired to evaluate and restructure the complaint handling process. The email ended with a direct acknowledgement of Sarah's role. "Miss Jones, I want to thank you again for your courage in bringing this issue to light. You've done more than highlight a failure. You've given us the push we needed to truly change. I hope this is the beginning of something better, and I am committed to ensuring it is." Sarah placed the phone back on the table, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to think that this wasn't just another PR move designed to pacify a disgruntled passenger. Time will tell, she thought, but for now, the smallest flicker of hope was enough. Later that afternoon, as Sarah made her way back to the airport, the terminal felt different. It wasn't that the bustling crowds or the steady rhythm of announcements had changed, but rather how she moved through it. She felt lighter, somehow, as if standing her ground had lifted an invisible weight she had been carrying for years. As she approached her gate, she noticed a familiar figure seated a few rows away. It was the older woman who had apologized the previous day. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman smiled faintly, a silent acknowledgement of Sarah's presence. Sarah nodded back, her expression calm. She didn't need words to know what the woman was trying to say. "I see you, and I'm learning." When it came time to board, Sarah moved through the priority lane without hesitation. This time, there were no skeptical looks, no snide remarks, no unnecessary scrutiny. The gate agent smiled politely as she scanned Sarah's ticket, and the soft beep that followed felt like a quiet triumph. On the plane, Sarah settled into her seat and gazed out the window as the engines roared to life. The familiar hum calmed her, each vibration a reminder of the steady path forward. As the plane climbed into the sky, Sarah let her thoughts wander. The events of the past few days would stay with her, but they no longer felt like wounds. Instead, they were reminders of what she had endured, of what she had achieved, and of what still needed to be done. The fight wasn't over. Change wouldn't come easily or quickly, but for the first time, she felt like the battle wasn't hers alone. As the clouds enveloped the plane, Sarah closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, the tension in her chest finally easing. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, full of possibility, and this time, she was ready for whatever came next. This story reminds us that standing up against injustice, even when the odds feel stacked against you, can lead to powerful change. It's not just about one moment or one person. It's about challenging the systems and behaviors that allow prejudice to thrive. It's acts of courage like this that ripple outward, inspiring others to find their voices and demand accountability. If you believe in the power of these stories to inspire change and want to hear more about resilience, justice, and the strength to overcome adversity, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. By sharing these stories, we keep the conversation alive, amplify voices that need to be heard, and show that together, we can make a difference.